Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to the Wix Wiz. Today we're going to be talking about how to populate a table using Velo. And we're going to be talking about two methods to do this. One is by using the rows and columns approach, and the other is by using the table Datafetcher method. So if you want to learn how to do all that and more, let's get started. So before we get started with some Velo code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new table to our website. So I'm going to add a section right over here. It's going to be a blank section. And here I'm going to add a brand new table. So let's go ahead and find another table. I'm going to add one with a slightly different design just so that we can differentiate between the two. And now we're ready to start coding this up. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on dev mode. And now we have our IDE open over here, and we can start populating this table with data. So in the first example, what we're going to be doing today is just showing how to take your data from the Wix website and populate a table with that same data. So the same data we were using previously in the datasets, we're going to be using now just using Wix data and querying. Okay, so I have obviously the table Velo reference open over here, which is going to come in very handy. And the first step to passing data to this table will be, of course, to fetch that data. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zoom in. And this first example that I'm showing you is going to be using this columns and rows technique. Okay, so we're going to be using columns and rows in order to populate the data of the table. And I'm going to, let me make sure I'm zoomed in enough so everybody can see. Zoom in one more. So I'm going to create a function. And let's call that function populate table. Okay, and the first thing that we're going to do in this function is we're going to need to fetch that data from the Wix collection. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to import Wix data. And then I'm going to set up a query. So I'm going to say const table data. Mock data query result, okay, is going to be equal to, and I'm going to be using async await here. So I'm going to add async right here before the function, and we're going to await the promise of Wix data dot query, and we're querying the collection called mock data. I'm just going to double check that. So you see over here, mock data, and I can copy the collection ID right over here and put that right in there. And I'm just going to do find. Okay, so I'm not limiting the data that I'm looking for here in any way. I'm just doing a regular query. And then I'm going to say const table data equals to mock data query results dot items. Okay, so now we have our table data. And what we're going to need to do is to pass in that data to our table. And the way this is going to work is we're going to need to set up columns and we're going to need to set up rows. So the first thing that we're going to do is set up the columns. And if we go over here to our handy dandy Velo reference and we go over here to columns, then we have an explanation here about how the columns are supposed to set up. So if we take a look over here in this example, so we can see here my table.columns, and it's taking in an array, and each of these items in the array is essentially an object. And this object has several properties. It has an ID, data path, label, width, visible, type, etc. Okay, and not all of these I think are necessarily required. Some of them are quite straightforward. So ID would be a column ID, and data path would be location of the data displayed in the column. So this, for example, would be, so here for the data path, basically this is how we are going to connect our rows to the columns. So we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about the rows. The label will be how it's displayed on the site, so what you actually see in the header of that column. The type is the data type, the width is the width of the column, visible is whether we want to see that column or not. And link path, to be honest, I'm not sure what it is. Location of links used when the items in the columns are clicked. Okay, so this is the field key from the collection that the dataset is connected to. Okay, we can try and explore this a little bit later on. Our current collection doesn't really have a link in it, but maybe I'll add some links just so that we can have this kind of demonstration, because it could be valuable, I think, to some of the people here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this over just to serve as the template for what we're going to be doing here. And this needs to be an array, so I'm just going to close off the array. And I'm going to say const columns equals. Okay? And we could choose to set it up like this, where we take each column that we know that we want to display from our data set, and we set it up by hand like this. So just for example, the ID here could be column 1 or whatever we want to do, and the data path would be, so for example, we're displaying first name, so the data path will be first name, and the label will be first name. The width will be 100, the type string, and for now, as I said, link path we're not going to really do. Okay, so that's how we would set up one column, and then we can go ahead, and I'm just going to change this to just plain old table, and I'm going to select our table element, and I'm going to say dot columns equals columns. Okay, and now if we go into preview mode, nothing happened. Awesome, awesome, awesome. I love it. I love it. I love it. Okay, so this did not work at all. I don't see the columns that we set up over here. So let's try and take a look and see why that might have happened. Okay, awesome. So we have an error in the code. No, okay, we don't actually have an error. That just took time for the code to load. Okay, awesome. So yeah, populate table. I did not run the function. Okay. Okay, populate table, sorry. I like to create everything in a function so it stays organized, but then you forget to run the function, and then awesome. Cool. So now you can see here that we have one very nice wide column that is called first name. Obviously, there's no data here, but we set up a column. Okay, and if we wanted to set up another additional column, we could go ahead and just copy over this template that we have here, and we can add another object right over here. And we can say, okay, so this will be column 2. These IDs obviously have to be unique. And this would be last name. And this would be last name. Okay, cool. And we can go ahead and preview that now. And we should see 2 columns, one first name and one last name. Okay, so that's the basics of how to set up the columns. This is a little, I'll call it risky, because we're doing everything manually. So that means that, if there is some change in our data source, then we're going to have to go into our code and manually change the columns by hand, which is not something that we ideally want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the actual fields that we get back with the data in order to create our columns. Okay, so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say, we're going to set up let me just think of how to do this. So I'm going to grab the first item from our table data. Okay, so I'm going to say const first item equals to table data, 0. And then I'm going to say, let's say const fields equals to object dot keys. And then I'm going to pass in the object here, which is first item. So basically what this does is it takes our object. An object is something that's built like this, okay? And it'll take all of the keys, which is, let's say, in this case, ID, data path, label, width, etc., and it'll turn it into an array called fields. And remember, these keys are going to be the fields of our collection. So they're going to be first name, email, last name, etc. Okay? And then here we can go and instead of having the columns equal to this, what I could do is I could say const columns equals to fields dot map. And here it's throwing me an error because we have columns declared twice. So I'm going to comment this one out for now. And I'm going to map this out. So I'm going to say for each field, then we're going to have an object. So I'm going to just wrap this over here like this. Awesome. And here this object is going to have several fields. So it's going to have an ID, right? And this ID can just be the, let's say ID field. Field, okay, 1 second. Cool, cool. So the ID will be, let's say, the field. And this is assuming that we don't have any two fields that are named exactly the same thing. And the data path will also be the field. And the label. So here with the label, this is where things get a little sticky because we're going to need to decide how we want to display the label based on the fields. And these fields are not pretty, to say the least. So what I would do here is you could build a function to kind of take these field names and kind of beautify them a little bit, make them look a little better. But I'm not going to do that right now because it's not really the focus of this tutorial. So I'm going to just go over here and write field. And here in terms of width, so this is assuming also that we want all the columns to be the same width. So this is going to be 100. And visible equals true. And link path, if we had it, we could add it, but we don't. So I'm just going to add it. Link path will be something, maybe in the future. And why is this not letting me assign the columns? Type is missing. Property type is missing. ID string. Width number. Data path string. I think this should be fine. Let's add console.log columns just to see what we get over here. Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead into preview mode. Okay, so first of all, it worked. So I don't know why Wix was sometimes the red squiggly lines. I mean usually 95% of the time if you see like the red line underlined, then you know you're having an issue. But if if you what's the word that I was looking for? Yeah, sometimes, especially when it's one of those type errors, then sometimes it's just some kind of fluke. I don't know why, but basically this did work. And if we go here and take a look at our columns, then we can see here that basically it built out all of these columns like that. Okay, so I mean, there's two approaches here, and obviously the second thing that I showed also has some of the downsides that you would have to work around. For example, you know, if you don't want to show all of these columns here, then you have an issue. And this is just showing the emails, I think, because it's kind of the mock data also had an email. Not our mock data, but the Wix mock data also had an email field, so it's just kind of still linking to it. But now we're going to talk about how to actually put our own data into this. Okay, so those are kind of two approaches to setting up columns. So I'm going to keep the one that I have set up. So I'm going to get rid of this. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to populate the rows. Okay, so let's go over here and let's take a look at rows. And awesome. So how do we set up rows? Awesome. So here we have an example of how these rows are set up. So it's also an array. And you'll see that each one is an object with all of the links between the columns and the actual data. And this key over here is the field name if the columns were set in the editor, and it's the data path if the columns were set up in code. Okay, so you could kind of do a hybrid where you set up the columns in the editor, and then you just populate the rows using code. So that would be this first case. But in general, it's not such a great idea to mix editor and code. So if you're already just doing this, then you might as well do the columns with code as well. So let's see how this would look. So I'm going to go over here to our editor. And because the data paths are using our field names that we got from Wix data, this is actually going to be really super easy for us because all we have to do is go like this. After the columns, we just have to say table dot rows equals to table data. Okay, because this table data is already structured as an array with all of the fields that we have from our columns, and the fields are already matching the data paths because we use those fields to set up the data paths. So this is kind of like the most easy peasy situation. We don't even have to do any kind of manipulation to the row data. And if I go ahead into preview mode, then we can see here that now our table is being populated with the data from our collection. Okay, so that's really set up here. And we should have about 50 items here. Okay, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how we can handle pagination. So one option would be to download all of the data in advance. So let's say I go, instead of having, whoops, let's go back to the editor. So I can, here in the query, I can set up dot limit, and then let's say 1,000. Okay, so this will download all our data at once because we have 1,000 items. And then I don't really have a need for pagination. Everything will just be set up here. But you saw that it kind of flashed for a second, the old table. And that's because the data took, I mean, like obviously it was like half a second, but like in terms of data loading times, it took a really long time for the data to load because it had to download 1,000 items. Okay, and in general, we might want to have a slightly better approach to pagination. So that's what we're going to talk about in a moment. So in order to set up pagination for our table, we're going to have to turn on the pagination property. Okay, so if we go over here into our table, we can see here that we have pagination, and there is a type, and there is a rows per page. Okay, so if we set normal, then there's no pagination. That will probably also be the default, which means that the table is scrollable, all the data is fetched at once. That's what we just saw before. Pagination will mean that the data is separated into pages, and they can be navigated using paging buttons. Okay, so there'll be actually buttons that will help us navigate between the different pages. And virtual means that the data is separated into pages, but the navigation is done by scrolling. So when you scroll till the end of the table or close to the end of the table, new data will be fetched. So we'll be exploring those two options. And let's start with this first one, which is pagination. So in order to set that up, we're going to have to go to our table. And before we even declare the rows and the columns, I'm going to set up the pagination. So I'm going to say table dot pagination equals to, and this is going to be an object because we have type, which is going to be pagination, and we have the other property, which I forgot, and that is rows per page. I'm going to copy that, and rows per page, let's have 10. Okay, so now that we set up this pagination, let's see what our table looks like in preview mode. And yeah, so when going into preview mode, this is a great point to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done yet. And here, okay, so here you can see that we have 10, kind of only 10, 10 lines, 10 rows. And we have this pagination option. So if I go right and left, then it'll kind of paginate between the data. Okay, that's what we have here. And let's check out the other pagination option, which was virtual. And go into preview mode. And now you can see here that, okay, that's not exactly what I expected. But the reason that it's acting like this most likely is because of this, okay, it's this limit. So basically, because we downloaded all the data in advance, even when we set this pagination to quote unquote pagination, it was just an aesthetic thing. It wasn't actually true pagination in terms of loading the data. So in order to set up this pagination so that it's true pagination, so that it's actually loading more data as we move from page to page, which is the real purpose of pagination, splitting up the data chunks. In order to do that, we're going to define a callback function called the Datafetcher. Okay, and this sets the function that executes when we want to fetch more data for our table, which will happen when we execute the pagination. Okay, and the way that this data fetcher works, they give an example here about what a typical kind of callback function would look like. So basically, we define this function, row retrieval function, and then we assign that function to Datafetcher. Okay, so myTable.Datafetcher. Okay, so let's start by defining this function over here. So I'm going to copy their starter code for this function. And here, this is a promise. So I'm going to go over here and let's just add this function right over here. Okay, so basically what does this row retrieval function do? So it has two parameters, and because over here I see that when we assign this function to the data fetcher, there's nothing, the parameters aren't mentioned here at all, which means that these are parameters which should be passed into the function from Wix, okay, from our table. And these parameters will be the start row and end row. And I'm thinking that these are the start row and end row of the data that needs to be fetched. Let's see. The index of the first row to get and the index of the last row to get. Okay. And let's take a look over here. And then if retrieval success, dun, 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 dun. So we do some kind of retrieval here. So we fetch the data from our collection in this case, or we're going to see later on from a third party. And then resolve resolves the promise. And we need to resolve the promise with the actual rows and the number of rows that we're adding in. And obviously, if we have a problem, we're going to reject. So the first thing that I want to do in exploring this function is to explore what this start row and end row is, because that's going to be key to successfully using this function. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to comment out this this statement over here, and I'm going to comment out this as well. And I'm just going to say if true, which it should always be the case. That shouldn't be an issue for us. Then I'm just going to, you know what? I overcomplicated things. I'm just going to get rid of this whole if statement, and I'm always going to resolve. Okay. And what I just want to do here is I'm going to add console.log start row, end row. Okay. And hopefully that means that when we assign this row retrieval function and we execute pagination, then we should be able to see what these two values are. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to assign this function to our table. So table.datafetcher equals to row retrieval function. And I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to limit this to 10. Okay, that means that when we query our collection, we're only going to get 10 items. So let's go ahead and preview this. Loading. 0, 10. Okay. So actually this data fetcher, I was expecting it only to run the first time when we actually fetch data, when we actually need to have pagination. So I expected the first time that our initial function would run and we'd populate the table using our first 10 rows, and then the data fetcher would run only later on. But apparently this data fetcher function runs also on the get-go. Okay, so because we defined a page as 10, so it basically tells us that we need from 0 till 10. Okay, so let's try and make some changes to our collection here. So what we're going to do is, sorry, not to the collection, but to the function that retrieves the data. Whoops. So I'm going to bring these back in. And here we're going to be doing our data retrieval. Okay, so this, which is our data retrieval, okay, is instead of being over here, I'm going to put it, okay, I'm going to leave it here just for the sake of our fields, okay, because we kind of created a dependency here. So I'm going to limit this just to one item. And then I'm going to copy this code and I'm going to put it right over here. Okay, and this is going to be an asynchronous function because we're getting data. And the limit of how many we're going to get is going to be const limit is going to be equal to end row minus start row. Okay, so this is going to be the limit because that's the amount that we need to get. And we're also going to have to add something else, but for now, to keep things simple, just to show you this first loading of data, I'm just going to leave it like this. Okay, so we get the table data, which is the items, and then we could say here, so if we can say here, if table data, then the page rows are going to be the table data, and the total row count will be table data.length. Okay, and now this should suffice for setting up our initial data fetch. So let's go ahead into preview mode and see if that's working. Awesome. Okay, so we got our first 10 items over here. Obviously, no additional pagination is happening, because every time that the pagination is happening, it is running the initial function. Let me change the type to pagination. Let's go into preview mode. Awesome. Page 1 of 1. Interesting. So it doesn't really know how to fetch more data. Interesting. Okay, let me just take a look here at this again. Table with ID contains 2 fields. Ah, okay. So, is an array of column. Okay, so this is the rows, total rows count. This is where I made my mistake. So the total rows count is the rows of all the pages. Okay, not just the specific page that we just fetched. Okay, so for example, if I go ahead and I change this to 1,000, yeah, total row count. Yeah, so 1,000. Then what we can do is we can go ahead and go into preview mode. And now it displays that we have 100 pages. But if we go and we try to do pagination, it'll always only load the first page. Okay, and that is something that I was expecting because inside of our query, we're limiting it to only 10, and we're always fetching from the same place in our collection. So that's why it's only getting the first 10. So what we need to add in here is a skip. And we need to determine how many to skip, and we're going to determine how many to skip by using this start row. Yeah, I think that should be start row. No, start row. Start row, end row. No, end row. By using start row. We're going to use start row. Sorry. It just, the logic of start and end there kind of confused me for a second. Okay, we're going to use start row. So I'm going to add here limit, and I'm going to add here skip and start row. And let's go into preview mode. Awesome. So this is our first page of data. And then if I go ahead and I paginate one forward, then we get the next page of data, which is Chris here on top. And what I want to just make sure that there's no overlap between the pages of data. So I'm just going to see the last one here is Brini. And I'm going to go to the next page. And yeah, okay, so the next one here is Elaine, which I'm assuming is another one. I want to make sure also that we're not missing any in terms of the data. Yeah, here we're getting the amounts from the callback function. Yeah, so this makes sense. This is how many we're skipping, right? Because this is the start number. And first we got 0 to 10, and then we skip 10, and then, yeah, I think that should be working. If it's super important, when you're doing in the live site, just double check. You might have to subtract 1 from the start row. I just don't really feel like doing complicated calculations and logic right now. But basically, this is the idea, that you will have to somehow use this start row or end row parameter here in order to determine what the skip should be. Okay, and awesome. In terms of determining the total rows count, so this is a little tricky if you don't know how many rows there are in your total collection, because we don't want to fetch all the data because that would kind of defeat the purpose of the pagination. Let me just check and see here in Wix query if there's some way for us to, if you know a good solution for this, this is a good time to leave a comment, because that could be, no, that's not the query that we want. We want data query. Wix data and query. So basically this, by the way, this is the skip and the limit that we were using. And what I want to find is if there's some way to aggregate, maybe can that help us? Count. I know there's a count option. Count. Let's see, what does this do? Resolve the number of items that match the query. But I wonder if this is limited. Let's try this. So we're going to use this count. So instead of using .find, we're going to use .count, which I'm assuming is quicker than .find, because otherwise that would also defeat our purpose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const. What does this return? Let's just see what this returns. It returns the actual number. Okay, as the promise. Returns number. Awesome. Okay, so let's say const total rows count equals to await, and then we're going to have this same query without the limit and the skip, but we're going to have .count here at the end. And this we can get rid of. And let's just add console.log total rows and have total row count. And let's see. So, I mean, naturally, Wix has a built-in limit of, I always forget if it's 50 or 100, but basically there's a built-in limit that if you don't add this limit method here, then it always limits it to that amount. So that's what I'm afraid is going to happen here. But let's give it a spin and see if that manages to get us the full count of all the rows. And as we enter preview mode, this is the time to like the video if you haven't done so yet. It is the time to comment if you have any questions, and it is the time to like the channel. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see the rest of this series. If you want to see more videos like this soon, then that would be the time to do it. Okay, so now we are back in preview mode. And awesome. Okay, so it actually got all the rows of the items. Okay, so that's how I would do it, I guess. If it's not a set row, it's not a set amount of items, which it usually won't be, then we would use the .count to get the full amount of all the rows, and yeah, set up our pagination like this. Awesome. I'm happy. I hope you're happy. Yeah, so that is what we're going to be. That's all for today. So this was the basics of how to set up a table using Velo. In the future videos, we're going to talk a little bit more about filtering, and we're going to talk about how to do something like this just using third-party data. Okay, so if you want to see that stuff, join me next time. Thanks for watching.